Operation Cobalt, the most devastating event to happen in the Walking Dead universe aside from the outbreak itself. On August 27, 2010, the dead began to walk the earth, setting into motion the collapse of society. But this wasn't what actually cemented the doom of America, as approximately 12 days after the initial outbreak, what was left of the federal government ordered the execution of the Sunset Protocol, a naive, last resort attempt to prevent the spread of infection by dropping napalm on every metropolitan city in the country, before sending in Marines awaiting on the outskirts to liquidate anything remaining, not only the dead, but the living alike. However, we've already covered this event quite extensively across multiple videos. What I want to discuss today is its short and long-term consequences on the country and its people over the following decades, and the state of America in comparison to other nations such as France that received no such event as a result. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. Now, of course, the most devastating consequence of these orders was the loss of human life and infrastructure countrywide. After the extensive damage caused, there would be no way of restoring power across the cities without years of cleanup and planning, leaving the few who managed to survive the flames to live a life largely in darkness as they relied on what little fuel they had to provide power through generators. But what you might not have thought about was the spread of these fires into the surrounding areas as nobody was left to fight them. The Fear the Walking Dead webisode Radio Waves presents a short story titled Should I Peek that features a park ranger named Ballard describing the site of Yosemite National Park as well as the Sierra Nevada mountain range burning away, estimating both would be gone within the week along with anyone who went out into the woods to camp this thing out alone. It's noticeable some cities were hit much harder than others, which we can assume probably came with a higher population. For example, Atlanta seems to be in relatively good condition in comparison to somewhere such as Los Angeles or New York, which could explain why we don't see some of the surrounding areas within Georgia burned away during the early days. Thankfully, forests grow back, but cities do not. So in the years following this devastating event, we see most survivors who lived long enough to establish colonies do so out in the country or in small towns or municipalities. Sure, there are exceptions to this as we see with the Barotse, but this largely seems to be the norm in the New World. According to George Geary in Fear the Walking Dead Season 2, the bombings reached as far north as Vancouver, Canada, meaning those who fled to the sea for safety would have no choice but to either go south, where the Mexican Border Patrol would turn them away, or head out into the open sea where anything could be waiting. If you were unlucky enough to find yourself on the island of Manhattan that night, you would have been greeted to the sight of the Air Force toppling the bridges, leaving you trapped by not only the flames and undead, but the sea on all sides, which over the following years resulted in a horde of over 1 million walkers flooding the streets with nowhere to disperse, forcing survivors to build lives on top of rooftops and on the upper levels of damaged skyscrapers. Simply put, if you found yourself within the center of a major metropolitan city during the outbreak, there'd be little to no hope for survival in the days after, no matter where you thought to run. And if by some miracle you did make it out, it would just be a life of digging through rubble and bodies for years to come. However, in one of the more interesting cases, the flames of Operation Cobalt are still speculated to be burning as late as 10 years into the outbreak, as we see with the blaze of Gory, located in Nebraska, which is an old tire junkyard said to have caught fire in the early days and never went out. Although it is important to note, it isn't actually confirmed this is what started the fire. Another theory by Elton suggests it could have been a result of the planes crashing on the night the sky fell in Lincoln. Regardless of its origins, I'm sure it would come as a stark reminder of that fiery night for anybody who happens to stumble upon it. Now, from everything we've learned across the franchise, the Sunset Protocol was the final order given by the federal government before radio silence, which left the military above ground without direction as infighting, defections, walkers, and other plunderers contributed to their seemingly universal fall throughout bases across the country. The army may have been warned of the bombs, but they were still left for dead all the same. However, despite the immense loss of life and infrastructure across the board, the most costly consequence of Operation Cobalt was the birth of a much harsher threat. You see, when the Air Force came for Philadelphia and Pittsburgh on that fateful night, the Pennsylvania National Guard had gone against federal orders by fighting them off in what has been dubbed the Second American Civil War, as they had initially taken a much more serious approach to protecting the civilians in their state opposed to what was commanded. However, their forces were stretched far too thin to defend both cities. So, in what was said to be an act of sacrifice, Major General Beale secretly recalled all of Pittsburgh's troops in the dead of night and allowed a horde of walkers to overwhelm the city, devouring the federal forces and civilians alike, as Philadelphia came out victorious thanks to an Air Force pilot named Donald Okafor, who defied commands by bombing Lincoln Financial Field, which held over 4,000 Marines awaiting orders to liquidate anyone on the ground, leaving the Pennsylvania National Guard to reform itself into the Civic Republic military based out of Philadelphia, which would ironically devolve into an equally sadistic organization come the year 2020, as they had taken the role of judge, jury, and executioner for entire societies projected to be a strain on their resources. It's still unclear how the cities of Omaha and Portland survived Operation Cobalt without any military aid. Perhaps, much like Atlanta, they received the bare minimum in terms of damage due to their low population in comparison to some of the other cities, and were simply able to rebuild and fortify in a much more organized fashion. But to the Civic Republic military, it didn't matter, as in their eyes, they for some reason weren't able to provide for themselves, resulting in a gas attack that killed Omaha's entire population and was set to do the same for Portland until it was intervened in the finale of 2 separate shows. You could argue the CRM's actions are worse than those of the US government's, as Operation Cobalt was a result of a calamity gone out of control, while the massacres committed by the CRM were cold, calculated, and seemingly pretty unnecessary. The Sunset Protocol may have been executed to stop the rise of a sinister beast. However, it just made everything far worse for those braving the storm in more ways than one. But what does life look like for survivors in other countries where no such events occurred? Well, over the last few years, we've gotten quite a lot of information on the surrounding world outside of America. And from what we've heard, the only other country to receive anything like this was Canada. However, it's unclear if this was by the Canadian government's orders or the US government just saying screw it. Regardless, despite being so close in geography, Mexico saw no such devastation. As discussed, the Mexican government was quick to set the military up at the border to prevent a mass migration of people fleeing south, which was maintained until at least a week after Operation Cobalt, as we see in Fear. And although wildfire devastated their population all the same, we see far more survivors just out in the open living their lives. It's actually quite jarring, as from an American's perspective, the world appeared dead and abandoned. Meanwhile, Mexico had colonies up and running since day one as civilians quickly adjusted to the situation. Like, it's pretty crazy. Nick can't even sleep in a seemingly abandoned house without getting chased out like a rat. Of course, we do see the occasional group or community in America, but they are pretty few and far between, especially in the early days and in previously densely populated areas. In comparison to Mexico, that has large, relatively civil trading outposts, survivors occupying their old neighborhoods, teams working to distribute water from dams, and overall just a sense the world has changed rather than flat out ended. Again, it's not like the apocalypse didn't happen, but given you played your cards right, it seems like you had a much more likely chance at surviving the initial outbreak than you would in America. And I honestly think this does come as a direct result of Operation Cobalt. Without the loss of everything that's been built at the hands of the people meant to protect you, it is much easier for society to adapt. Most people living within cities around Mexico, and by extension any country that didn't receive bombings, could have rode out the entire initial outbreak from the comfort of their own home, which was just not the case in America as they were thrown out into the wild. You could say the state of Mexico, by the time we see it, was a result of its early placement in the timeline. But we actually see a pretty similar situation in France through the Daryl Dixon spin-off, which is set about 15 years after the outbreak. Sure, France had its own issues entirely independent from what anywhere in the world had to deal with, but by 3 episodes into Daryl's journey, we again come across survivors around every corner. And I'm not even just talking about the Abbey or the various colonies we meet. There are people just living in apartments within post-apocalyptic Paris. Daryl literally just walks down an overgrown street surrounded by the dead and sees regular people within their homes minding their own business. Pavor delivers food to open, unsecured areas, and civilians just flood in from out of nowhere to collect it. Many call the city home and are relatively civil despite the dead still walking the streets, to the point where nightclubs have been established downtown and are actually pretty successful too. Which is just not possible in American cities outside the surviving super colonies unless extensive work is done to rebuild. We've begun to see glimpses of this type of society form the deeper we get down the timeline, as brand new towns and coalitions are being established away from the destruction. But what if the American government had chosen not to drop napalm in the streets? Instead, what if, much like the Pennsylvania National Guard, priorities were to save as many civilians as possible by all means rather than to exterminate those outside of designated safe zones? Well, it's almost guaranteed society wouldn't be nearly as devastated as we see throughout the franchise. Listening in to all the voices screaming for help over the radio waves during Fear Season 2, it sounds like hundreds were making it by while attempting to adapt to the situation until they were forced to flee from the bombs. And that's just survivors off the coast of LA alone, so I believe we would have seen a hell of a lot more cities repopulated within the first couple years aside from the big 3 we already know. Daryl Dixon Season 2 proposed the prospect of the UK actually surviving the initial outbreak, having been quick enough to lock down their borders to prevent a total calamity. However, the information is given by 2 untrustworthy sources, and by the time we see Daryl and Carol pass through the tunnel, the entire military checkpoint had already fallen. But if this is the case, we're about to see what it looked like for a government to successfully defend its population from wildfire, which would really highlight the failure that was Operation Cobalt. Perhaps America wouldn't have devolved into a country plagued with anarchy. Maybe tyrants such as Negan would have never gotten the chance to rise in power, and certainly organizations such as the CRM would have never been formed in the wake of a power vacuum. However, this isn't the reality our survivors live in. All these events happened and changed the course of American history. By now, most of the dead have dispersed into the wider country, leaving the charred cities behind, awaiting someone to rebuild them. Although the truth is, it'll be decades before society in America is at a point where it can fully clean up the old government's mess. But at least we're starting to see beacons of light return within the ruins, as the Dead City Season 2 trailer has shown us the beginning stages of reclamation in Manhattan has begun. So perhaps one day, generations from where we are now, the horrors of Operation Cobalt will be forgotten about entirely as humanity rebuilds atop the ashes.